Welcome to an introduction to educational research. This video, the research process. This is part 2, research designs. The purpose of this video is to briefly introduce the different types of educational research designs or research plans that there are out there. Let me offer a word of advice. 4 different categories of research designs will be presented, and a total of 13 different subcategories of designs will also be presented. Please don't panic or get frustrated. It's not necessary at this time for you to remember all of the characteristics of all of the designs that are presented, but rather try and get an overview of the different research categories and subcategories. You will have the opportunity to delve deeper into the designs because subsequent videos concerning almost all of the designs will be offered later in the course. So sit back, relax, take a few deep breaths, and let's give it a go. Now, the last video presented an overview of the 2 major philosophical methodologies researchers utilize to conduct research. And we talked about the qualitative methodologies and the quantitative methodologies, and how they are 2 totally different methods of solving different problems. And the graphic on your screen represents the reciprocal relationship between these 2 approaches. On the left-hand side, you have the qualitative approach, which starts out with generalizations from observations. So it starts with observations and it forms generalizations that may lead in an inductive way to the development of theory. And the quantitative on the right-hand side starts out with a theory and develops hypotheses and tests those hypotheses and collects data. And so that's the cyclical relationship between the 2. Also in that video were the 4 main purposes or functions of educational research. There was basic research, applied, evaluation research, and action research. The purpose of this video is to present a global overview of the various ways researchers try and conduct and design their research plans. The choice of a specific research design greatly influences the research procedures and the research outcomes. Therefore, it is incumbent on the researcher to select the appropriate research design for the specific research question or topic under investigation. Well, why should you care? Well, there are 2 good reasons. An understanding of the implications of selecting one design over another and the resulting influence on the research plan and results will make you a more critical and informed consumer of research. That's the first. The second one is for those of you who select and decide to do a research study for your thesis. Knowledge about various research designs and their implications will assist you in selecting an appropriate design for your study. So for you, it's sort of a win-win situation. Well, okay, now on your screen, you see types of educational research, and on the left side, you see quantitative research methodologies. On the right side, you see the major heading, qualitative research methodologies. On the left side, under the quantitative research methodologies, you see experimental research methodologies, and they include true experimental, quasi-experimental, and pre-experimental. And then you see a category called single case or single subject research designs, and you see 5 different designs there. ABAB design, multiple baseline design, multiple probe design, changing criterion design, and multi-element design. Well, we're going to start on the left side, and we're going to start looking at the experimental research, and the first one we're going to look at is true experimental research. Now, true experimental research, which is usually pretty rare in education, but it is the only type of research that can establish a cause and effect relationship. The only type of research. The defining characteristics are random assignment of participants to groups. Usually it's a control and an experimental group, although there could be more groups. It's characterized by the manipulation of the treatment or the independent variable by the researcher. In fact, those first two, random assignment of participants to groups and manipulation of the treatment or independent variable by the researcher, are the distinguishing characteristics of all true experimental designs. Also, the independent variable or the cause or the treatment is under the researcher's control. The researcher manipulates the treatment. The dependent variable or the effect or the variable of interest or what the researcher is collecting data on, the researcher is observing any change in the dependent variable. The results of true experimental research are usually reported in descriptive and or inferential statistics. We're looking for statistical significance. Results are reported in probability statements and confidence intervals. Remember, nothing is ever proved in research. Research indicates probability statements. And as I said earlier, this kind of research is relatively rare in education. Now let's look at the quasi-experimental. Now this design is frequently used in education. The difference between quasi-experimental and true experimental is that sometimes it's not possible to randomly assign individuals to groups, and that results in a lack of control on the part of the researcher. So if you're working in schools, it would be very difficult to break up classrooms and randomly assign students to one group and to another group. You probably have to use existing classrooms. So the researcher usually must use existing groups that already exist. And therefore you run into the problem of the equivalency of the groups, because if the groups are not equivalent in whatever attributes the researcher is studying, that can present a threat to internal validity, as you're aware. So one of the things that quasi-experimental is not as powerful as true experimental is non-equivalent groups. Now let's look at pre-experimental. Pre-experimental is a very weak design that allows for many threats to validity, to internal validity. So for the sake of researchers, it is a very, very weak design. However, for the sake of a classroom teacher, it may be a very important design, because the classroom teacher may not be so concerned with total internal validity or total external validity, but may be concerned with addressing a problem within the classroom. Usually pre-experimental designs take the form of a one-shot case study where a single group, let's say your classroom, is exposed to a treatment and then you give them a post-test. Well, actually, that's sort of what you do in a classroom. No matter what your subject matter, if you're teaching mathematics, you give your lesson and then you give some kind of an assessment on how well students did. Another form of this design would be one group that is pre-tested, then there is some kind of a treatment and post-tested. Or you could have two groups. One group receives a treatment, one group is the control group and does not get the treatment, and then both groups are tested. And as I said, this is a very weak design in terms of pure research, but it could be a very useful design in terms of a particular classroom and a particular teacher. So that's pre-experimental. Then there are a series of 5 what are referred to as single case or single subject designs, although the name single subject is somewhat of a misnomer because it indicates that there would only be one subject, but that's not necessarily true. Now, there are times that group experimental designs may not be possible or practical, as we've talked about, especially in schools, or let's say in special education when you're dealing with some very low incident populations. It's almost impossible to be able to get a sample where you can randomly select individuals. So there are times that we need research designs that will allow us to establish good internal validity, but do not use large samples and do not use random sampling. But yet they still have good internal validity. And these are referred to as single case or single subject designs. And there will be a video on each of the 5 single case designs that you see listed there. So that is the quantitative research methodologies under the experimental part. Now we'll look at non-experimental designs under the quantitative research methodologies. And under non-experimental, we have descriptive research, correlational research, causal comparative research, and survey research. Descriptive research, the purpose is to describe current status and so that it can become a basis for asking additional questions. So it describes the situation as it exists at the time of the research. The sampling and instrumentation are very, very important in descriptive research. The sample that you're using and what instruments you're using to gather your data. Let me give you an example of descriptive research. When I was at the College of New Jersey in their Department of Special Education, I had an undergraduate research group, and we decided to look at the verbal interaction patterns of professors of higher education and students, graduate and undergraduate. So we did a descriptive study, and what we did is we videotaped different classes, graduate and undergraduate, all different subject matters. We videotaped them and we had a coding system. So we wound up then with a great deal of data that described what the verbal interaction patterns between professors in institutions of higher education and graduate and undergraduate students. So that was a descriptive study. Next, under the non-experimental, is correlational studies. Now, correlations or correlations, that's actually what it comes from, are attempts to determine whether and to what degree a relationship exists between 2 or more variables. The goal is to discover a relationship or lack of a relationship or be able to predict on the basis of that. And your SAT scores, there is a correlation between student performance on SAT scores and their performance in their first year of college. That's why colleges use the SAT, because it gives them a chance to be able to predict the success of students. So correlational studies show the strength and direction of a relationship. A correlation coefficient, which is a statistical formula measure, will give you a score between +1, which means a perfect positive correlation, through 0 to -1, which means a perfect negative correlation. Now, you have to be very careful about correlation. Correlation does not indicate causality. if you have a very high positive correlation between two variables, that doesn't indicate causality. There is almost a perfect +1 correlation between a person's foot size and their ability to read. That's so. There's almost a perfect correlation between a person's foot size and their ability to read. But that doesn't mean that the bigger your foot is, the better you read. What's the obvious confounding variable there? Well, age. A baby has a small foot. They don't read very well. As a child gets into kindergarten, their foot may grow a little bit more and they may begin to start to read, but as an adult, their foot is fully grown and they can read. So there's a confounding variable there. So you have to be very careful in interpreting correlations. But there'll be a video on correlations, so we'll talk more about that later. The next is causal comparative research, or what's referred to as ex post facto, or after the fact. Now, the purpose of causal comparative research is to investigate whether one or more pre-existing conditions have possibly caused differences in groups of subjects. Unlike the true experimental research, the researcher cannot or elects not to manipulate the independent variable in causal comparative research. So here's an example of a title for causative comparative research: the effects of preschool attendance on reading scores at the end of the second grade. Well, this research took a look at who attended preschools and what their reading scores were at the end of the second grade. But it would be unethical for the researcher to say, oh, well, your child can attend preschool, but your child can't. They go to the control group, and your child can, and your child can't. That would be unethical. So how this research was done was they looked at reading scores at the end of the second grade, and then they went back through the records and saw which students had gone to preschool and which students had not gone to preschool. So the independent variable, which was preschool attendance, was not manipulated in this case. Another example, the effects of smoking on lung capacity of patients 50 years or older. Well, the independent variable is smoking, but it would be totally unethical to assign people to smoke and assign people not to smoke. So that's causal comparative research. And finally, under the non-experimental is survey. And in survey research, researchers ask questions about people's beliefs, opinions, characteristics, and behavior. And a survey researcher may want to investigate associations between respondents' characteristics, such as age, education, social class, race, and their current attitudes towards some issue. Survey research can take many, many forms. And survey research typically does not make causal inferences, but rather describes distributions of variables in a specific group. And of course, you're very familiar with political polls and census and things like that. Well, okay, that covers the quantitative research methodologies. Now we're going to move to the qualitative research methodologies. And under the interactive qualitative research methodologies, we have ethnography, which is an in-depth study of naturally occurring phenomena or behavior within a cultural or social group. What are the cultural patterns and perspectives of this group in its natural setting? And this is referred to as field research. And researchers observe group behavior as it naturally occurs in the setting without any imposed structure or preconceived hypothesis. So researchers, let's see, Jane Goodall in Gorillas in the Mist was out in East Africa for years, I think 20 or 30 years, and just lived and observed gorillas. No preconceived hypothesis or anything. Pure observation. Data collection procedures include prolonged observation by the researcher interviewing members of the culture if you're working with Homo sapiens, and examining documents and artifacts that the group produces. So that's ethnography. Now the second interactive is the phenomenological. In the phenomenological research, there is an assumption that multiple realities exist and that they are rooted in the subject's perspectives, which is a very typical qualitative assumption. An experience has different meanings for each person. Phenomenological studies engage the researcher in a long process of individual, usually unstructured interviews in an attempt to fully understand the phenomenon from the person or group's perspective. And there are some examples listed there, which I'll give you a second and you can look at those. Well, okay, that's the phenomenological. Then there is case study. And a case study are in-depth studies of a single unit, referred to as a case. It could be an individual, could be a group, could be an organization, could be a program. And the goal is to get a detailed description and understanding of the one unit or the case. And there are a multitude of data collection procedures that can be used. And there are a couple examples of what research titles might be, and I'll let you read those. Okay, for case study, we have what is referred to as grounded theory. And grounded theory research attempts to develop a theory of social phenomenon based on field data collected in the study. As the researcher or researchers gain experience with the data they collect, they begin to generate insights and hypotheses and questions. And these are pursued further with further data collection. So the researchers construct concepts and then form a theory by proposing plausible relationships among concepts. And therefore, the theory is said to be grounded in the data. As an example, I'll let you read the example. I don't need to read it to you. Okay, for grounded theory. Then under the qualitative research methodologies, we have non-interactive research, and an example of that is historical research. And historical research involves studying, understanding, and interpreting past events to get insight into those events. There are two sources of data: primary data, which would be like first-person eyewitness interviews, talking to authors, collecting real documents. And secondary would be non-first-person accounts. And historical research doesn't have an internal or external validity. It has external criticism and internal criticism. External criticism means how authentic is the data that I have? Suppose I'm looking at documents. How authentic are these the real documents? Whereas internal criticism is, well, these documents may be real, but what they say, is that true or not? Is that true? Well, that is historical research. Well, we've made it through types of educational research. Here are the resources that were used in this video. There is a worksheet, a written assignment, which should have been emailed to you with the assignment. So please complete that and attach it to your assignment number 4 and then email it to me. And thank you very much.